Welcome, everyone. We're in Isaiah 54 and 55 tonight. And so if you could please turn there, we can get started. I wanted to give you a little overview of chapter 54, and to do that, I have quoted in your notes a man named John N. Oswalt, who wrote a commentary on the book of Isaiah that I thought was helpful. In chapter 54, he says, "The stress is on the wonder of God's love for His people." The wonder of God's love for His people. You can already tell it's going to be a good chapter. It's a very positive, encouraging K-Love chapter. I can tell you that right now. In language similar to that of 26, 1-3, 27, 2-8, and 29, 22-24, and 30, 23-32, in other words, a lot of other places in Isaiah, he speaks of the amazing love of God who is able to dispose of His righteous anger in a moment and who glories in the wonderful opportunities to bless His people. Sometimes I think we fall too far on one side or the other of that equation. There are some times that I think we emphasize His wrath, and then other times we emphasize His desire to bless us, His love. And those are both idols. Neither of those is the true God. And you could probably think of denominations or Christian movements that specialize in one of those two categories, either focusing on the holiness of God and His wrath, or focusing on only His love. And the truth is that God is both, as we'll see in this chapter. The wrath has got to be there, because otherwise He's a pushover and He's not taking sin seriously, and He doesn't care about righteousness and justice and the affliction of the needy. But He doesn't take pleasure in His wrath. He's like pushing through it to get to the part where He can bless His people. It's a real blessing. The expansive language of verses 1-3 and 11-17 is almost that of explosive relief. After God's people has suffered, He's now bringing them back. All of God's cosmic desire to bless can finally be released, and it pours out in ways that only the most extravagant imagery can express. So that's, I think, a good intro to chapter 4. And so let's begin in verse 1. Shout for joy. Very positive opening line, right? Shout for joy. Does anybody remember what the last chapter was about? What's that? Waters? No? It was about the suffering servant, right? It was in some ways a very depressing chapter, because this righteous person is suffering for the sins of everyone else. It's very sad. But at the same time, there's a depth there, there's a serenity, and there's salvation as a result of that. So it's not like bad news overall, but it is a kind of a downer chapter, right? And now, suddenly, in chapter 54, we shift gears and we begin with shout for joy. It's time for rejoicing. O barren one, you have borne no child. Break forth into joyful shouting and cry aloud, you who have not travailed. For the sons of the desolate one will be more numerous than the sons of the married woman, says Yahweh. As with chapter 49, which we covered a few weeks ago, the second half of chapter 49, God is again speaking to Zion using a number of metaphors. Zion, or in other words, He's talking about His people here. He's not talking about a woman. But it's a metaphor. He's speaking about this, His people, as if His people were a barren woman. Zion is a barren woman who suddenly starts having children. And we have to keep in mind the historical context here, that what we have is a lot of proclamations in Isaiah that the people need to repent, and then declarations that God is going to use a nation to do His judgment, to accomplish His judgment by conquering His people, pulling them out of their land, and then he's going to bring them back to their land. And so where are we at in the scale of things in chapter 54, in the timing of things, where after they're coming back into the land, and she's not a barren woman anymore. But just take it from the perspective of when Zion was empty those 70 years. While she lay in ruins, overgrown with weeds and languishing from neglect, she bore the shame of a barren woman. Barrenness in the ancient world was no minor matter, for a woman's status depended in part on how many children she had. This theme appears frequently in the Bible. Think of Abraham and Sarah. Sarah couldn't have any children. She bore that reproach for decades until she was way past the time of having children. And then what did God do? He gave her a baby. Baby Isaac, right? Isaac grows up. He goes and finds a woman. He marries her. She can't have kids either. And so then he has to pray for her, and then God opens her womb. It happens over and over in the Bible. Jacob and Rachel. Jacob and Leah never had any problems, but Rachel couldn't have any kids. Remember? So she gave her servant to Jacob and then finally God opened her womb. Elkanah and Hannah, another very famous incident where Hannah was barren, and the other wife used to make fun of her. And she was praying so intently that Eli thought she was drunk in the temple, right? And she said, I'm not drunk, I'm just in agony here. I want to have a baby. And so this happens a lot in the Bible. Or Zechariah and Elizabeth, who had John the Baptist. So this happens over and over again. And it's not like in any society it would be easy to be a barren woman. It wouldn't be easy in any society. But in the ancient world of Isaiah, it was even worse than it would be today. It would just be a horrible reproach. But again, we're not speaking about a woman here. We're speaking about the people of God, or Zion, the city of God. Verse 2, enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch out the curtains of your dwelling. Spare not, lengthen your cords, and strengthen your pegs. This is the picture of a tent here. Verse 2, in the ancient Near East, women were responsible for erecting and maintaining the family tents. I did not know that. I figured that was guys' work. Does Connie do the tent when you guys go out, or you do it? Camping? She does it? No, you do it? I only camped once since I've had my own kids, and I did the tent. But in the ancient world, that was, it's the woman's domain. It's the tent, I guess. I don't know. But that's how they did it. And so now that she's going to have children, she needs to expand her living area, a task that she, no doubt, accomplishes with glee. In contrast to her former devastation, Israel now establishes herself anew. So we have verse 1 calling Zion this barren woman. In verse 2, and what is he telling the barren woman? He's telling her, shout for joy. Why? Because she's getting her kids back. Or she's about to have kids. Not getting them back, but about to have kids. And so we're going to need some enlargement here. Let's take a look at that verse in Jeremiah 10:20, because it really does use a similar way of speaking on the opposite end. So where I'm locating us is after the exile, when they're returning to the land and the city is being restored. Okay? Jeremiah is dealing with before the exile, when the enemies are coming to take the people out of the city. Okay? So what we're about to read in chapter 10 is before that. We'll start in verse 19. Woe is me because of my injury. My wound is incurable. But I said, truly, this is a sickness, and I must bear it. My tent is destroyed, and all my ropes are broken. My sons have gone from me and are no more. There is no one to stretch out my tent again or to set up my curtains. It's sort of like the opposite of what we just read in Isaiah, that when the devastation came to Zion, that it was spoken of metaphorically as a tent that was, knocked down or destroyed. Back to Isaiah 54. And then now that it's being restored, it's enlarge your tent, stretch out your curtains, spare not, lengthen your cords, strengthen your pegs. Verse 3, for you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess nations and will resettle the desolate cities. The expansion was originally promised to Jacob when he dreamt at Bethel. Now this is also promised to Abraham and Isaac before that, but the one here, let's take a look at it. Genesis 28:14 was when, if you recall, Jacob is, he comes to this place. He ends up naming it Bethel, which means the house of God, after he has this dream. And we call it Jacob's ladder, where he sees the angels ascending and descending. But he receives this promise, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel, right? So this is the original Israel here. Genesis 28, verse 14 says, your descendants, this is a very stereotypical Abrahamic promise that Jacob is receiving here. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And so part of this Abrahamic promise was the idea of expansion, of spreading out, of multiplying. And taking it from the perspective of Judah, which had suffered so greatly during the conquest of the Babylonians until it was just Jerusalem left, and then finally Jerusalem fell, and so many people died, and then they were taken away. It would seem that God had given up on the Abrahamic promise to make you like the sands of the seashore and as the stars in the sky. Right? Ezra numbers the people on the way back, doesn't he? It's not more than he could number. It's like 49,000 people or so, if you read the beginning of Ezra. It wasn't Ezra, it was Joshua and Zerubbabel, but it's in the book of Ezra. And so one might think, well, God's given up on this plan, or maybe he's forsaken us. And so this is written to contradict that. Isaiah 54, verse 3, you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess nations. This is hundreds of years after the Jacob dream and the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is hundreds of years later, and God is still speaking the same way. He still intends to fulfill this promise. Your descendants will possess nations. Now this one, in other translations, is dispossess nations. And it's a word that can be translated possess, inherit, or dispossess. If I hear possess, I'm thinking take over. I'm thinking imperialism. I'm thinking spreading to conquer other nations. If I hear dispossess, I'm thinking the book of Joshua, where they came into the promised land and they dispossessed the nations that were there and took that promised land for themselves. So I think it's worth noting the next line there, will resettle the desolate cities. So I think this is talking about, let's see here, returning to the land to reclaim both inhabited and forsaken cities. So there are people living in certain of these cities that they're going to dispossess of that, and then there are other cities that are forsaken and they're going to inhabit. And I say that because in Deuteronomy, in the verses I have in your notes there, this same word is used frequently to talk about how they're going to go in and, it doesn't say under Joshua, but we know it happened under Joshua, dispossess the nations. So this all comes together as a picture of returning to the land and getting it back. Verse 4, fear not, for you will not be put to shame. Do not feel humiliated, for you will not be disgraced, but you will forget the shame of your youth and the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. She will be so fruitful that she will forget her shame. She will hold her head high and enjoy a profusion of divine blessings. Like I said before, to be barren was to endure a shame in the ancient world. People would think that you have sinned, or people would think that you're cursed by God. And I'd say a lot of times they're probably wrong. I don't know why that theology stuck around so long. But We have plenty of examples of people that weren't cursed by God and then God healed them. But nevertheless, that shame would be there, even if it was totally false. And God's talking about deliverance from that. The other example is of widowhood. The destitution of someone whose husband had died in the ancient world was severe. It was hard. It would be not just hard, it would be very hard to find any kind of job other than, something that was sinful, something that you wouldn't want to do. And so there's a shame, there's a reproach with that too. And people are, thinking about things in that way. I'm reminded of the story of Ruth and Boaz. We'll get there in a second, but just hold that in the background. What happened to her? She had no kids, and her husband died, and on top of it, she was a foreigner living in Israel. I mean, there was nothing going for her at all. She's so poor that how does she feed herself? She has to pick up the scraps on the edge of the field, right? Glean from the edges of the field. So, I mean, this is the kind of reproach that she was bearing. And so the people or the city is thought of as bearing this reproach. You've got no people living in you, you city, right? You've got nothing going on for you. You're like a barren woman or a widow, someone whose husband has died, and there's no one to care for you. Really graphic imagery. And the idea is that God is going to redeem the city. You will forget your shame, and the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. Verse 5, for your husband is your maker, whose name is Yahweh of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth. For Yahweh has called you like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, even like a wife of one's youth when she is rejected, says your God. For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you. Back in your notes. Although she was once like a forsaken wife, she will find reconciliation and restoration. This is like the story of Ruth and Boaz that I just mentioned. And if you remember the story, Boaz redeems her. And he has to pay a certain price, and there's sort of a public ceremony of sorts that occurs so that it's clear to everyone that she is now brought out of her shame, out of her widowhood and everything else, and into the family and the protection and the honor and status of Boaz. And so this is a picture of what God does for his city, that God is now going to bring the city out of that sort of situation and give her dignity and blessing. Verse 7 and 8 in your notes, God's wrath passes in a moment. I think we need to read that. Let's read verse 7 again. For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you. In an outburst of anger I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting loving kindness I will have compassion on you, says Yahweh your Redeemer. This is what I'm talking about, balancing the wrath and the love of God. Like, there is wrath, and you don't mess with it. He's going to talk about Noah in a second. You want to talk about a genocide? This is a pan-genocide. All of the races were exterminated. I mean, God's wrath is not to be trifled with, but it's not like that's his base core characteristic or attribute. That's a necessary outworking of his holiness and his righteous, and the fact that he's in charge of the Justice Department of the universe. But he expresses that, and then he's rushing into the love as quick as he can, and that's where he wants to stay, is that everlasting love. Read it again, verse 8. In an outburst of anger, I hid my face from you for a moment, or 70 years. And with everlasting loving kindness, I will have compassion on you, says Yahweh your Redeemer. This word translating loving kindness, I don't know if any of you have worked on that much, or in the King James, I believe it's mercy. It's the word chesed in Hebrew, with a nice chet on the front of that word there, chesed. And so this is a word that translators really struggle to make into English. And depending on what translation you read, you will have a different word here. What do you have in the ESV, Mom, back there? In verse 8, What is it? Everlasting compassion? Isn't it steadfast love or something? Okay. With everlasting love, it says? Okay, so we have love. Chesed is at the core of God's character. I have a chart here for you in your notes. It occurs 255 times in the Old Testament in the following distribution. You see that really long bar at the top? You know what book of the Bible that is? Psalms. That's what they sang about. They sang about God's chesed. Imagine that, writing a song and you have this chesed right in the middle of it. Just so beautiful to the ear. In Hebrew, I'm sure. But 130 times in Psalms, and then in these other ones, a lot less. And you can spot Isaiah on there. It occurs 8 times in Isaiah, which accounts for 3% of the total. Of course, Psalms is hogging like 51% there. But Isaiah does have it these 8 times, and this is a couple of these times we're going to see right here. But this is a significant word, and so I found a definition in this commentary I have, and I wanted to present it to you. This is from John Oswalt. He says, no single English word can encompass all the connotations of this Hebrew word, but its basic idea is of passionate loyalty. Passionate loyalty, especially of a superior to an inferior. In its basic usage, it refers to the obligations of covenant. But in the biblical experience of God, it comes to express that loyalty which goes far beyond any legal obligation in a passionate concern for the well-being of the other. Excuse me. It is this that God has for His people, which expresses itself in grace, mercy, unfailing love, kindness, and several other similar English words. Chesed is the core of how God relates to His people. If we go back to Deuteronomy and read the book of Deuteronomy, we'll see that there God says, if you forsake me and go after other gods, you will be kicked out of the land. God is the landlord. They are the tenants. He can evict them if they break the arrangement, right? The covenant. And so the being in a relationship with God, then as now, is based on a covenant. And the covenant, part of the covenant was you're supposed to worship Him alone and not make these other gods and worship them. And so for God to remain faithful to the covenant, He had to kick them out of the land. That's part of His responsibility. That's not Him saying, I'm mad at you and I don't want to talk to you anymore. That's part of Hesed for God, is kicking them out and then also bringing them back when they have repented. And so this is really the baseline for relating to God. Although exiles living in Babylon for multiple generations, just imagine that. Let's say you were born in Babylon as one of these captives who has this memory that the grandparents tell you growing up about this strange city far away that once had great kings in it, like David and Solomon. But here you are in Babylon, your whole life, and it's just stories to you. And, how are you going to explain this? Many people would think God has forsaken them, or worse, that He wasn't powerful enough to save them. But His Hesed demands that He not give them up. God is still it doesn't matter if His people think He's forsaken them. It doesn't matter if His people think that Marduk is more powerful because Marduk won the war, which is how the ancient mind would think. Whichever God's most powerful is the one that wins. None of that matters because God is still going to be faithful to it. God's still going to send out the call. God's still got all these different people in different situations doing things like Daniel, like Ezekiel, and these other people that are Ezra, Zerubbabel, Nehemiah. These people are strategically placed within the governments of Babylon so that this whole thing can happen when the time comes. He made a covenant, he made covenant promises, and the seemingly end-of-the-world scenario that the captives endured is really just a detour on the road back to their promised land. And that's the position of faith, that growing up in Babylon, you would have to teach to your children and your grandchildren would be, look, God has a covenant with us. He has an agreement with us. He's the only true God. And you're like, well, what about all the statues? What about all these other gods? They seem so real and legit, and really, you could just imagine the tension there. This, Isaiah 54, was written before they went. That would be really helpful. And a lot of the archaeologists and the scholars and so on, they locate or they put the dating of synagogues to this Babylonian captivity that they were developing at that time. I don't know if that's 100% or not, but it makes sense because, hey, if you're living in a foreign land where the religion of everyone around you is radically different than your own, you're going to want to develop little community centers where you can teach the truth, where you can read from the book of Isaiah publicly to your people and say, look, this is what the Lord God says. He's going to bring us back to that land. And at the point of 70 years, they came back. Those not everyone, but those who agreed to, making the journey, they were free to go when Cyrus took over, the Persian. Just absolutely miraculous. Isaiah 54, back to verse 9. For it is like the days of Noah to me. You ever think about like how God's memory is? He's like, this is like the days of Noah to me. When I swore that the waters of Noah would not flood the earth again. So I have sworn that I will not be angry with you, nor will I rebuke you. And I love verse 10. For the mountains may be removed and the hills may shake, but my chesed, my loving kindness, will not be removed from you, and my covenant of peace will not be shaken, says Yahweh, who has compassion on you. It's just absolutely our God there. I mean, beautiful. Hesed is parallel to covenant. The idea is that God's faithfulness and loyalty to His people are more steadfast than massive rocks and towering mountains. He picks things that don't move. He picks things that are really big. And He says, look, even if they moved, I wouldn't. And of course, they're not going to move. You know what I mean? Verse 11. O afflicted one, storm-tossed and not comforted, behold, I will set your stones in antimony, and your foundations I will lay in sapphires. Antimony is like a dark-colored mortar, so that if you put a stone in it, it would really make the stone look nice. It really pop out with the color. And your foundations I will lay in sapphires. Moreover, I will make your battlements of rubies, and your gates of crystal, and your entire wall of precious stones. This is that extravagant language that God uses to talk about this restoration. The metaphor now switches from a woman to a city. Both, of course, refer really to the people, right? The people of God, who have just been redeemed from exile. This imagery bespeaks wealth and prosperity. See also the New Jerusalem in chapter 21. Later on, when we talk about the ultimate restoration, you have all these stones mentioned, you have all these beautiful jewels mentioned, and that is bedecking the New Jerusalem. Verse 13, all your sons will be taught of Yahweh. The sons of whom? The sons of the city, that's got all these jewels. Your children, O Zion. He doesn't actually use the word Zion here, so I'm making that connection on the basis of other chapters where he talks like this. And I should have mentioned this to you, but it's in a footnote there, number 2, that in Galatians 4:27, the Apostle Paul quotes verse 1 and mentions it as being Jerusalem above. So that could definitely have a reference to the future as well as something that happened in the past. The blessings are not limited to prosperity, but also encompass understanding God. And in verse 13, it says, all your sons, verse 13, all your sons will be taught of the Lord. And another translation, I think, has discipled of the Lord. The well-being of your sons will be great. The word well-being here is the word shalom, peace. You know? And so it's bigger than just no war. I mean, it's well-being. It's, you know, things are the way they should be. Your sons will be taught of Yahweh, and the well-being of your sons will be great. In righteousness you will be established. You will be far from oppression, for you will not fear, and from the terror, for it will not come near you. Verse 15, if anyone fiercely assails you, this is again talking about the city, it will not be from me. I thought that was so interesting. God's saying, look, now if somebody attacks you, I didn't send them. What a strange thing to say. Why is that a strange thing to say? Or why does he say it? Well, the last time they were attacked, he did send them. The Babylonians, God sent to judge his people. And there's a really big difference when somebody's attacking because they're, you know, belligerent or whatever, they just want to wage war, and when somebody's attacking because you've sinned and God's behind them and fighting them is not going to do any good. Right? Wasn't that the message of Jeremiah that, hey, look, don't fight the Babylonians. God sent them. You're not going to win. Just give up. Real popular message there. Poor Jeremiah. But so God's saying here, look, you know, somebody might attack you, but I didn't send them. Whoever assails you will fall because of you. And so, and we get into the idea of God protecting them right after this. Verse 16, behold, I myself have created the smith who blows the fire of coals and brings out a weapon for its work. And I have created the destroyer to ruin. And now we get this famous verse that everybody likes to quote. No weapon that is formed against you will prosper. And every tongue that accuses you in the judgment you will condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of Yahweh, and their vindication is from me, declares Yahweh. People may still attack, but it is not because God has sent them, as he did with Assyria and Babylon. The God who made the one who made the weapon can frustrate the endeavors of those who try to use weapons against his people. He is the God who vindicates. So God's saying, like, I made the maker of the weapon. I think I can handle protecting you from it. Right? No weapon formed against you will prosper. You know, I think the image is not that there's a force field bubble surrounding Jerusalem, but that people may attack, but God's going to help them defeat them. And that's true to history. People would attack, and they were unsuccessful after the exile, up until the year 63 BC, when the internal fighting among the Israelites between two rival kings was so severe that the city invited the Roman general in and said, hey, we'd rather have you. And Pompey, the Roman general, annexed Jerusalem without a battle. You know? And so that's how Judah became a province of the Roman Empire. And then eventually they revolted twice in the first century and then again in the second century. Okay, what verse are we in? Can I just read that chapter again? Because you know, sometimes when I chunk it up and we take it verse by verse, we miss the big picture, we miss the continuity, and it's just so beautiful. It's so grandiose that let's just take it again. Shout for joy, O barren one. You have borne no child. Break forth into joyful shouting and cry aloud. You who have not travailed. For the sons of the desolate one will be more numerous than the sons of the married woman, says Yahweh. Enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch out the curtains of your dwellings. Spare not. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen the pegs. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess nations and will resettle the desolate cities. Fear not, for you will not be put to shame, and do not feel humiliated, for you will not be disgraced. But you will forget the shame of your youth and the reproach of your widowhood. you will remember no more. Verse 5. For your husband is your maker, whose name is Yahweh of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth. That's a good memory verse, huh? Verse 5 there. Verse 6. For Yahweh has called you like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, even like a wife of one's youth when she is rejected, says your God. For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you. In an outburst of anger I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting loving kindness I will have compassion on you, says Yahweh your Redeemer. For this is like the days of Noah to me, when I swore to the waters of Noah would not flood the earth again. So I have sworn that I will not be angry with you, nor will I rebuke you. Verse 10. For the mountains may be removed, and the hills may shake, but my loving kindness will not be removed from you, and my covenant of peace will not be shaken, says Yahweh who has compassion on you. O afflicted one, storm-tossed and not comforted, behold, I will set your stones in antimony, and your foundations I will lay in sapphires. Moreover, I will make your battlements of rubies, and your gates of crystal, and your entire wall of precious stones. All your sons will be taught of Yahweh, and the well-being of your sons will be great. In righteousness you will be established. You will be far from oppression, for you will not fear, and from terror, for it will not come near you. If anyone fiercely assails you, it will not be from me. Whoever assails you will fall because of you. Behold, I myself have created the smith who blows the fire of coals and brings out a weapon for its work, and I have created the destroyer to ruin. No weapon that is formed against you will prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment you will condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of Yahweh, and their vindication is from me, declares Yahweh. Ho! Ho! Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. I struggle to see how one chapter connects to another chapter in Isaiah, and sometimes it's easy, and sometimes it's not clear to me. In this case, I'm not 100% sure that these two things go with each other. I could take it either way. And when it says, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, you who have no money, come buy and eat, come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Verse 2, why do you spend money for what is not bread and your wages for what does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good and delight yourself in abundance. When it says that, I struggle to find a historical moment when, food was free in Israel. I just don't know of any time that ever happened. These words, they either must be metaphorical or eschatological, vocab word for the day, eschatological. It means related to the end times, or both. Since Israel never functioned on such communism, although the early church did, at least in early Acts there, not as a political system, but as a voluntary economic situation where people shared stuff, basically. So, I don't know, what do you think? Metaphorical or eschatological? You think this is a metaphor, not really talking about food and water and wine and milk, or that it's really talking about some other spiritual things? Let's take a look at that possibility first. John 4:14. We'll come back to Isaiah. And then we'll take a look at the sort of echoes that seem to be there in Revelation as well. See if that can help us make a decision here. John 4:14. This is the time where Jesus was at the well with the Samaritan woman. And the conversation is about water. John 4:14, or we'll start in verse 13. Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Jesus is not talking about water. Not literal water here. He's talking about finding, your strength and your sustenance in him. That it wells up to eternal life. Or the Holy Spirit, which is many times pictured as a liquid that people are, filled with or baptized with, immersed in, and so on. The other one is John 7, verse 37, where you have this, somewhat of this concept of thirsting and being satisfied and not being thirsty again, or this metaphorical usage of it, where it's not really talking about water. 7:37, now on the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." What is he, a water boy? No, he's not talking about water. He who believes in me, as the Scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. But this he spoke of the Spirit, which those who believed in him were to receive. For the Spirit was not yet given because Jesus was not yet glorified. And so this is a very clear example of this idea of come to the water and drink, and it's not talking about literal water. It's using it as a metaphor for the Spirit. Now let's look at the eschatological possibility in Revelation 21, where we see that in the future, in New Jerusalem, there actually might be some sort of free food. Now, I was raised that there's no such thing as a free lunch, but, maybe we say not yet. I don't know. Revelation 21, verse 6. Then he said, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost." Seems like a serious echo from Isaiah 55, verse 1 that we just read there, huh? It's not a direct quote, or else in the NASB it would be all capitalized. But it's an echo or an allusion with an A that goes back to that. "He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." Chapter 22, verse 17. "The Spirit and the bride say, 'Come.' And let the one who hears say, 'Come.' And let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who wishes take the water of life without cost." So, these things echo forward into this grand vision of the kingdom of God, that there is this satisfaction of, sustenance that is going to be there forever. Now, whether this is a literal water or a metaphorical water, I don't know. It could be both. But I just wanted to chase that through and show you how these things can be used metaphorically or just as something that would happen way in the future of our own future, not just Israel's future here. So back to 55, Isaiah 55. "Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come and buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why do you spend money for what is not bread?" Why are you doing the things that aren't satisfying you? You think it's going to satisfy you, but it doesn't. "And your wages for what does not satisfy. Listen carefully to me and eat what is good and delight yourself in abundance." Verse 3. "Incline your ear and come to me. Listen that you may live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, according to the faithful mercies shown to David. Behold, I have made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. Behold, you will call a nation you do not know, and a nation which knows you not will run to you, because of Yahweh your God, even the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you." In your notes, verses 3 and 4. Since Israel already had a covenant with God, see in verse 3 it says, "I will make an everlasting covenant with you." They're already in a covenant. Why is he going to make an everlasting covenant with people who are already in a covenant? This everlasting covenant must be a new one. And we see that in Jeremiah 31 and Hebrews 8 and Hebrews 10, that there is this new covenant that the next prophet after Isaiah, Jeremiah, would give us more detail on. That this is more likely a reference to the Davidic Messiah than David himself is shown by the apostles' use of it in Acts 13:34. Paul sees Isaiah 55 verse 3 as a reference to the resurrection of Jesus. Incline your ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. And I will make an everlasting covenant with you according to the sure mercies, the faithful mercies shown to David. The ultimate, and he's, of course, the ultimate Davidic descendant. That's why Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, starts out with his kingly pedigree, his genealogy. You know, it comes right through David. Sorry about that. And you can also see Psalm 2:7 or 2 Samuel 7:14. These are both Davidic messianic promises, like the 2 Samuel 7:14. It's easy to remember, right? Because 2 times 7 is 14. 2 Samuel 7:14. Throw that out there. 2 Samuel 7:14 is the promise where God says to David, look, one of your descendants is going to sit on the throne, and he's going to rule forever. So this is sort of like the original Davidic promise of one who would come, and we know that that was Jesus, based on many things, but Hebrews 1:5 makes that clear as well, that it's being applied to Jesus. That the Messiah would draw the nations unto himself, in verse 5, behold, you will call a nation you do not know, and a nation which you know not will run to you. That sure happened, right? We're here, right? If you're not Jewish and you're reading Isaiah and I think that's already a partial fulfillment of this. That the Messiah would draw the nations unto himself is also predicted in Isaiah 2, verses 3 to 4, chapter 42, verse 4, and 49, verse 6. Jesus knew his death was required to draw all people to himself. In John 12:32, Jesus stands up and he says, look, I'm going to be lifted up and I'm going to draw all people unto myself. And this is in the context of some Greeks who came to see Jesus and ask him about stuff. This mystery of Gentile inclusion began to be understood when Philip preached to the Ethiopian and Peter converted the Italians. That's Cornelius. He was Italian. However, the theology and full outworking of the Davidic Messiah's accomplishment would not be spelled out until Paul's writings. And I cite for you Ephesians chapter 2, where we read this before, but it talks about how the Gentiles would be brought into the commonwealth of Israel and be made partakers of the promises. And so, I think this is already happening. The nations are already, being called in. If we had time to go to it, we're out of time now, but Isaiah 49 from a couple weeks ago, if maybe you'll recall, God says, it's too small a thing that I'm going to make you as my servant to help Israel. I'm also going to make you a light to all the nations, and in you the Gentiles will trust. So this idea of the Gentiles coming in, it's not just in this one place. It's really several times in Isaiah, and then it's unpacked for us in the New Testament. So let's take a break. Come back in 15 minutes.